The gun trembled in Victoria Sterling's manicured hands as she stared at the massive lion standing between her and the bloodied veterinarian. Dr. Ben Hartwell's weathered fingers pressed against the fresh surgical wound on Courage's flank, his 70-year-old frame shielding the beast that should have been dead by now. This wasn't supposed to happen. Emma Hartwell Morrison dropped her coffee mug, ceramic exploding across the Montana sanctuary floor as her children screamed behind overturned chairs. The pharmaceutical heiress she'd trusted with a $250,000 donation was pointing a weapon at her father and grandchildren. Ben's mind flashed to Sarah's last words, "Promise me you'll keep fighting for what matters," as Courage's amber eye fixed on Victoria with an intelligence that defied nature. The tumor that should have killed this lion had somehow transformed him into something Ben couldn't explain. "Step away from my investment, old man." How had a simple act of compassion unleashed a chain of events that would either destroy his family or reveal the shocking truth about the woman who claimed to save animals? And why was this dying lion the only thing standing between them and something far more sinister than anyone imagined? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 weeks earlier, the August heat shimmered across the Montana plains as Dr. Benjamin Hartwell limped toward the wooden crate abandoned at his sanctuary gates. At 68, every step reminded him of decades spent wrestling with wounded animals and wrestling with grief. The Second Chance Wildlife Sanctuary stretched across 50 acres of scrubland, his life's work teetering on the edge of bankruptcy since Sarah's medical bills had drained their savings 2 years ago. The note taped to the crate was brief. "Please save him. The zoo gave up." Inside, a magnificent lion lay motionless, his golden coat matted with blood and a grotesque tumor consuming half his face. Ben's veterinarian instincts kicked in despite his arthritic hands. This wasn't just any lion. Something in those amber eyes spoke of intelligence and suffering that went beyond the physical. "Well, big fella," Ben whispered, his voice carrying the soft drawl that had comforted countless animals over 4 decades. "Looks like we're both a little worse for wear." Sarah always said he talked too much to his patients, but she'd been gone long enough that her gentle teasing only echoed in his memory now. The sanctuary's financial records spread across his kitchen table told a grim story. 50,000 in debt, 30 days until foreclosure, and now a lion requiring surgery that would cost more than his annual income. Ben's daughter Emma called from Seattle every Sunday, her voice tight with worry and frustration. "Dad, you can't save every broken thing that comes through those gates," she'd say, never understanding that saving broken things was the only way he knew how to survive Sarah's absence. Emma Hartwell Morrison lived a structured life 2 states away, marketing executive, soccer mom, keeper of schedules that didn't include room for her father's animal obsession. Her children, Sophie and Jake, asked about Grandpa Ben during their brief holiday visits, but Emma kept those interactions limited. Too many childhood memories of missed school plays because Dad was delivering a calf or canceled family vacations because someone brought in an injured hawk. The lion Ben would later name Courage had been born Rex at a failing roadside zoo in Nevada. 5 years of captivity had taught him to read human moods, to understand the difference between kindness and cruelty. When the tumor began growing 18 months ago, his pride had gradually rejected him, nature's harsh logic determining that weakness threatened the group's survival. Ben set up a makeshift recovery pen in his barn, watching as the lion's behavior defied everything he knew about wild animals. Courage seemed to understand conversation, positioning himself protectively whenever strangers approached, and showing an uncanny ability to sense Ben's emotional state. During those first sleepless nights, when arthritis pain kept the old veterinarian awake, Courage would lie against the barn wall closest to the house, as if standing guard. Sarah always said animals could read souls, Ben murmured, studying the tumor that would require a miracle to remove. Wonder what you're reading in mine, boy. The morning Ben discovered the full extent of Courage's condition, frost still clung to the Montana grass despite the August heat that would follow. Dr. Maria Martinez, the only veterinary oncologist within 300 miles, drove her mobile clinic up the gravel drive at dawn. Her preliminary examination confirmed Ben's worst fears. The tumor wasn't just disfiguring, it was growing toward the lion's brain with aggressive speed. Honestly, Ben, I'm surprised he's still alive, Dr. Martinez said, her voice gentle but clinical. This type of fibrosarcoma usually, well, most animals don't last this long. She ran her hands along Courage's massive frame, noting his unusual calm during the examination. The surgery would be extremely complex. We're talking about facial reconstruction, possible removal of the left eye, and there's significant risk of brain damage. Ben's weathered hands trembled as he signed the estimate, $45,000. The number might as well have been $45 million. His checking account held $862, and the mortgage payment was already 3 weeks overdue. Sarah's medical bills had consumed their retirement savings, her life insurance barely covering the funeral costs. That afternoon, the bank's foreclosure notice arrived with the cruel efficiency of bureaucracy. 30 days to pay or lose everything: the sanctuary, the house, Sarah's rose garden that he couldn't bring himself to tend, but couldn't bear to see destroyed. Ben sat on his porch swing, the same spot where he and Sarah used to plan their retirement travels, watching Courage pace the recovery pen with determined dignity despite his obvious pain. The lion had begun following a strange routine. Every morning at exactly 7:30, Sarah's breakfast time, Courage would position himself at the fence line closest to the house and remain motionless for exactly 10 minutes. Ben recognized the behavior from his decades of veterinary practice. Animals often developed ritualistic behaviors when processing trauma or forming attachments. Emma's weekly phone call came Sunday evening, her voice carrying that familiar edge of frustrated concern. "Dad, you sound tired. Are you taking your arthritis medication? And please tell me you're not taking in more strays." When Ben mentioned Courage, her silence stretched long enough for him to hear her children playing in the background, the sounds of a normal family life that felt impossibly distant. "A lion, Dad. Seriously. You can barely afford to feed yourself, let alone—" Emma's voice cracked with the weight of watching her father slowly disintegrate since her mother's death. "Maybe it's time to consider assisted living. There are nice places in Seattle where you could be close to the kids." "Your mother always said this land would heal broken things," Ben interrupted softly. "Reckon it's still got some healing left in it." The conversation ended badly, as they always did now, with Emma's promise to think about visiting hanging between them like an unfulfilled prayer. Tuesday brought Victoria Sterling in a black Mercedes that looked obscenely expensive against the sanctuary's weathered buildings. She emerged from the vehicle with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention, perfectly coiffed silver hair, designer clothes that somehow remained immaculate despite the Montana dust, and eyes that assessed everything with calculating precision. "Dr. Hartwell, I presume?" Her voice carried the polish of East Coast education softened by years of corporate negotiations. "I'm Victoria Sterling. I represent a private foundation interested in wildlife conservation." She extended a manicured hand that had never known manual labor. "I heard through certain channels that you have a remarkable lion here." Ben's instincts, honed by decades of reading both animals and people, immediately signaled caution. Something about Victoria's intense focus on Courage specifically, not the sanctuary's mission or other animals, raised red flags. When she asked detailed questions about the lion's background, his health status, and especially his behavioral characteristics, Ben's responses became increasingly guarded. "I'd like to make you an offer," Victoria said, pulling a checkbook from her purse with theatrical flourish. $100,000 for the lion, cash today. You could use it to save your sanctuary and help many more animals. The amount was staggering, enough to solve every financial problem and fund the sanctuary for years. But something in Victoria's eyes when she looked at Courage reminded Ben of the trophy hunters who occasionally contacted him about problem animals, a hunger that had nothing to do with conservation. "He's not for sale," Ben said firmly, watching Victoria's composed mask slip just slightly. "Everything has a price, Dr. Hartwell. I'm simply trying to find yours." Her smile remained perfectly polite, but her tone carried an undercurrent of steel. "I'll be in town for several days. Perhaps you'll reconsider once you've had time to think about your circumstances." That evening, Ben sat beside Courage's pen as shadows lengthened across the Montana plains. The lion's amber eye held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Ben felt like someone truly understood the weight of protecting what mattered most. Victoria Sterling returned the next morning with the persistence of someone unaccustomed to hearing no. This time she brought a leather portfolio filled with photographs and documents that she spread across Ben's kitchen table with practiced efficiency. The images showed various exotic animals in what appeared to be luxurious private facilities: tigers lounging beside swimming pools, bears in manicured enclosures, and lions in settings that looked more like movie sets than conservation centers. "These are some of my previous acquisitions," Victoria explained, her fingers tracing the photographs with an almost reverent touch. "Each animal received the finest care, the best veterinary attention, everything they could possibly need." Her voice carried a maternal warmth that somehow made Ben's skin crawl. "Your lion would want for nothing." Ben studied the images more carefully, noting the subtle wrongness in each scene. The animals looked healthy but hollow-eyed, their postures suggesting resignation rather than contentment. One photograph showed a magnificent male lion that bore a striking resemblance to Courage. Same build, same intelligent gaze, but captured in what appeared to be an ornate indoor setting with marble floors and gold fixtures. "Where exactly are these facilities?" Ben asked, his veterinarian's eye catching details that troubled him: stress markers in the animals' postures, environments that prioritized aesthetics over natural behavior. "Private estates, mostly. Collectors who understand the spiritual significance of powerful animals." Victoria's answer was deliberately vague, but her eyes lit up with an intensity that made Ben uncomfortable. "There's something special about apex predators, Dr. Hartwell. They carry the essence of pure strength, untamed power. Some cultures believe that proximity to such creatures can transfer their qualities to those wise enough to appreciate them." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Martinez's arrival for Courage's pre-surgical evaluation. The tumor had grown visibly larger in just 3 days, creating a sense of urgency that made every decision feel loaded with life or death consequences. The oncologist's examination revealed that they had perhaps 72 hours before the pressure on Courage's brain would cause irreversible damage. "I've seen cases like this progress rapidly," Dr. Martinez explained, her expression grave. "The window for successful surgery is closing fast. Without intervention, he'll likely experience seizures, then coma, then—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Ben watched Victoria's reaction carefully during the medical discussion, while Dr. Martinez spoke about surgical risks and recovery timelines. Victoria peppered her with questions about the lion's physical condition post-surgery. Would he retain his strength, his natural instincts, his Essential qualities? The question struck Ben as oddly specific, more concerned with Courage's potential value than his welfare. That afternoon, Emma arrived unannounced, her rental car kicking up dust clouds as she pulled into the sanctuary drive. Ben hadn't seen his daughter in 8 months, and the sight of her stepping out of the vehicle, looking so much like Sarah with her determined stride and worried expression, nearly brought him to tears. Behind her, his son-in-law David emerged with Sophie and Jake, their faces bright with excitement at seeing their grandfather. "Dad, we need to talk," Emma said without preamble, though her stern expression softened when Courage approached the fence line. The lion's behavior toward the children was remarkable. He lowered himself to their eye level, his massive head tilted in what could only be described as gentle curiosity. "Grandpa, he's beautiful," 12-year-old Sophie whispered, reaching toward the fence before David gently pulled her hand back. "What happened to his face?" "He's sick, sweetheart," Ben explained, kneeling beside his granddaughter. "But we're going to try to help him get better." The simple explanation couldn't capture the complexity of the situation. The financial impossibility, the strange woman circling like a well-dressed vulture, the growing certainty that Courage represented something far more significant than a routine rescue case. Emma pulled Ben aside while the children remained fascinated by Courage. Her investigation into the sanctuary's financial records had revealed the full scope of the crisis. Not just the current debt, but the mounting costs of maintaining the facility on a fixed retirement income. "Dad, you can't save every animal that comes through those gates. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let go." "Your mother never let go," Ben replied quietly, watching Courage interact with his grandchildren through the fence. "When the doctors said there was no hope, she kept fighting. When the treatments failed, she kept believing. Even at the end, she was planning what we'd do when she got better." His voice broke slightly. "Maybe I can't save every animal, but I can try to save this one." The argument that followed was 20 years in the making. Emma's childhood resentment about competing with animals for her father's attention, Ben's inability to express emotions except through his work, and the unspoken grief they both carried about Sarah's death. David tried to mediate while the children remained blissfully absorbed in watching Courage, but some conversations require the participants to finally say things that have festered too long in silence. "You care more about these animals than you ever cared about me," Emma said, tears finally breaking through her composed facade. "Even now, even when you're facing bankruptcy, you'd rather risk everything for a lion than admit you need help." "That's not true," Ben started, but the words felt inadequate against the weight of her accusation. Victoria chose that moment to return, her timing too perfect to be coincidental. She observed the family drama with calculating interest, particularly noting the children's immediate attachment to Courage and Emma's obvious distress about her father's situation. When she approached with another offer, this time $150,000, her presentation was clearly tailored to exploit the family's emotional vulnerabilities. "I understand this is difficult," Victoria said, her voice carrying practiced sympathy. "But sometimes love means making hard choices. Your father could secure his future and still honor his commitment to animal welfare." She gestured toward Courage, who had positioned himself protectively between the family and this new stranger. "Some animals are meant for greater purposes than we can provide." The way Courage reacted to Victoria's presence was unmistakable. Hackles raised, body language defensive, a low rumble in his chest that spoke of instinctual recognition of danger. Ben had seen similar reactions in animals who had been abused, but Victoria presented herself as a benefactor. The contradiction troubled him more than her generous offers or persistent pressure. The surgery began at dawn on a Thursday that felt heavy with consequence. Dr. Martinez had assembled a small team from the veterinary college, 2 surgical residents, and an anesthesiologist who made the 3-hour drive from Billings. Ben paced the sanctuary grounds while Courage underwent the most complex procedure the makeshift facility had ever attempted, his arthritic hands clasping and unclasping as he muttered prayers to a God he'd questioned since Sarah's death. Emma had stayed overnight, sleeping in her childhood bedroom for the first time in 15 years. The walls still held her high school ribbons and photos of family camping trips, back when their biggest worry was whether Dad would get called away for an emergency during vacation. She found herself studying those old photographs, seeing her father's dedication differently now, not as neglect, but as a man who threw himself into healing because he couldn't bear to see suffering go unanswered. The surgical team worked with methodical precision, carefully separating the tumor from healthy tissue while monitoring Courage's vital signs. The mass was larger than expected, its tendrils having grown deeper into the facial muscles than the imaging had revealed. Dr. Martinez made the difficult decision to remove Courage's left eye to ensure complete tumor extraction, a choice that would save his life, but forever mark him as different. Victoria arrived during the surgery's 4th hour, ostensibly to check on Courage's progress, but clearly hoping to find Ben at his most vulnerable moment. She carried coffee and pastries from the town's only bakery, playing the role of concerned friend with practiced ease. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," she said, settling beside Ben on the porch swing. "Perhaps we could arrange a partnership instead of an outright purchase. I could fund the surgery and ongoing care while you maintain day-to-day responsibility." Ben studied her carefully manicured appearance. Not a hair out of place despite the Montana wind, makeup applied with precision that suggested someone unaccustomed to early mornings or genuine emergencies. "Why this particular lion, Mrs. Sterling? I've got 3 other big cats in the sanctuary, all healthier and more suitable for whatever you have in mind." Victoria's pause lasted a heartbeat too long. "Courage has something special, don't you think? A resilience that speaks to larger possibilities." Her choice of words felt rehearsed, like dialogue from a presentation she'd given before. Some animals transcend their physical limitations to become symbols of strength. The conversation was interrupted by Sophie and Jake's excited voices as they discovered a family of barn cats that had taken residence near the feed storage. Their innocent delight in simple discoveries reminded Ben of Emma at that age, before cynicism and adult responsibilities had taught her to question every moment of joy. David was documenting everything with his phone camera, creating memories that Ben realized he'd failed to make with his own daughter. Dr. Martinez emerged from the surgical trailer at noon, her scrub stained with blood but her expression cautiously optimistic. "The tumor is completely removed, and he came through the anesthesia well. The next 48 hours will be critical. We need to watch for infection, brain swelling, and his adaptation to monocular vision." She pulled off her surgical cap, revealing sweat-dampened hair and the exhaustion of someone who had just performed a miracle. "I have to say, Ben, his heart rate remained remarkably stable throughout. It's almost like he understood what we were trying to do." Courage's recovery began with the disorienting awakening that follows major surgery. His remaining eye opened slowly, focusing first on Ben's weathered face hovering nearby, then gradually taking in the unfamiliar medical equipment surrounding him. The left side of his face was wrapped in bandages that would need daily changing, but his breathing was strong and his responses to stimuli encouraging. Victoria's reaction to seeing the post-surgical Courage was telling. Where Ben saw courage and resilience, she seemed to see something that excited her in ways that made him profoundly uncomfortable. "He looks even more magnificent now," she murmured, approaching the recovery pen with reverent steps, "like a warrior marked by battle." Her fingers traced the air above his bandaged face without actually touching him, as if she were already imagining some future interaction. The first sign of Courage's unusual recovery came that evening when he refused to eat the standard post-surgical diet, but accepted small pieces of meat only when Ben offered them directly. "Doctor, Martinez had warned that appetite loss was normal after such trauma, but Courage's selective eating suggested something more complex, a level of trust and attachment that went beyond typical animal behavior. Emma watched her father's gentle ministrations with growing understanding. The man she'd resented for missing school events was the same man who now sat beside a recovering lion, reading aloud from Sarah's favorite poetry book, because he believed familiar voices aided healing. "Mom used to read Frost to me when I was sick," she told Ben quietly, settling on a hay bale nearby. "I never understood why she chose poetry over children's books." "Your mother said poetry contained compressed truth," Ben replied, not looking up from the book. "She figured if you were going to be still long enough to listen, might as well fill your head with something beautiful." His voice carried the weight of remembering someone whose absence still felt fresh after 2 years. Victoria's presence became increasingly intrusive as Courage's recovery progressed. She arrived earlier each morning and stayed later each evening, always with some pretext, bringing supplies, checking on progress, or offering unsolicited advice about post-operative care. Her questions grew more specific and troubling. How much did Courage weigh? What was his normal body temperature? How quickly were his reflexes returning? The breakthrough in Courage's recovery came on the third day when Sophie was visiting. The 12-year-old had been reading aloud from her school book while sitting safely outside the recovery pen, her young voice carrying the same gentle cadence that Sarah had used. Courage, who had been listless despite improving vital signs, suddenly lifted his head and moved toward the sound. When Sophie looked up from her book, the lion's single remaining eye held an alertness that made everyone present catch their breath. "He recognizes kindness," Ben murmured, watching the interaction between his granddaughter and the wounded animal. "Your grandmother always said animals could see straight through to someone's heart." The moment felt significant beyond its simple beauty, a connection that suggested healing went deeper than surgical intervention. David, who had been skeptical about the sanctuary's mission, found himself documenting these recovery moments with growing fascination. His background in journalism had trained him to recognize authentic stories, and what he was witnessing felt unprecedented. "Has he always been this responsive to people?" he asked Ben during one of their quiet conversations. "Not like this," Ben admitted. "It's almost like the trauma changed something in him, made him more aware, I guess." Sarah used to say that sometimes what breaks us also opens us up to connections we never thought possible. The observation carried weight for all of them. Emma with her fractured relationship with her father, Ben with his grief-induced isolation, even David with his growing appreciation for work that prioritized meaning over profit. Victoria's increasing desperation became apparent when she raised her offer to $200,000 during Courage's first week of recovery. The sum was astronomical for a sanctuary operating on donated supplies and volunteer labor, but her delivery lacked the polished confidence of her earlier negotiations. Something about Courage's post-surgical behavior seemed to be driving her urgency in ways that had nothing to do with normal animal collecting. Emma's investigation into Victoria's background began with simple internet searches, but quickly revealed disturbing patterns. Sterling Pharmaceuticals had been involved in several lawsuits related to animal testing, and Victoria's son Michael had died in an industrial accident at one of their facilities. The timeline suggested that Victoria's interest in powerful animals had begun shortly after her son's death, coinciding with what appeared to be a complete personality change according to business associates. The revelation of Victoria's true intentions came through an overheard phone conversation that David accidentally recorded while documenting the sanctuary's daily routines. Victoria was speaking to someone about traditional preparations and spiritual transfers, using language that suggested beliefs far removed from conservation or animal welfare. When she mentioned needing the heart and liver to be properly harvested, the context became horrifyingly clear. Ben's confrontation with Victoria that evening took place in the sanctuary's main building, away from the children, but with Emma and David present as witnesses. "I know what you're planning," he said without preamble, his usual politeness replaced by the protective instincts of someone defending family. "Whatever you believe about animal spirits or strength transfer, it ends here." Victoria's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the grief-maddened woman beneath the polished exterior. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking with desperate intensity. "Michael died because I wasn't strong enough to protect him. The company, the safety violations, the cover-ups, I failed him as a mother. But if I can absorb the strength of apex predators, if I can become what he needed me to be." Her words trailed into incoherent mumblings about ancient practices and spiritual redemption. The confrontation ended with Victoria's promise to return with legal documentation proving her right to claim courage, but her threats carried the hollow ring of someone whose careful plans were unraveling. As her Mercedes disappeared down the gravel drive, Ben realized that the real battle was just beginning, and that Courage's recovery had made him not just a symbol of healing, but a target for someone whose grief had transformed into something dangerous and unpredictable. Victoria returned 3 days later with 2 men in expensive suits, and a third whose military bearing and calculating eyes suggested a different kind of professional altogether. The legal documents they presented were sophisticated forgeries claiming that Courage had been stolen from a private collection and that Victoria Sterling held rightful ownership through a complex chain of purchases. Ben studied the paperwork with growing alarm. Whoever had prepared these documents understood both animal law and bureaucratic procedures well enough to create convincing lies. "These papers are fraudulent," Ben said, his veterinarian's methodical nature serving him well as he identified inconsistencies in the documentation. "The dates don't match the timeline of when Courage arrived here, and this supposed previous owner doesn't exist in any registry I can find." Victoria's composure had deteriorated noticeably since their last encounter. Her perfectly styled hair showed signs of neglect, and her designer clothes couldn't hide the tremor in her hands or the hollow desperation in her eyes. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm prepared to be reasonable about this situation. Transfer ownership voluntarily, and I'll ensure your sanctuary receives substantial ongoing funding. Resist, and my legal team will seize the animal through court orders while simultaneously investigating your facility for violations." The third man, who had remained silent during the legal presentation, stepped forward with the fluid movement of someone accustomed to violence. "Mrs. Sterling has been very patient," he said, his voice carrying an accent that suggested Eastern European origins. "In my experience, patience has limits." His eyes surveyed the sanctuary's buildings with professional assessment, noting sight lines, escape routes, and vulnerabilities. Emma, who had been monitoring the situation from the house, called 911 while David positioned himself between the children and the strangers. Sophie and Jake had been playing near Courage's recovery pen, their innocent laughter providing stark contrast to the tension building among the adults. The lion himself seemed to sense the threat, positioning himself at the front of his enclosure with alert posture despite his recent surgery. Ben's decision to stand his ground came from a lifetime of facing difficult choices in veterinary practice. Sometimes you had to risk everything to save what mattered most. "Courage stays here," he said simply, his weathered hands steady despite the odds. "I've seen what you people do to animals, and it won't happen on my watch." Victoria's breakdown began with bitter laughter that held no humor. "You think this is about an animal? This is about redemption, about becoming strong enough to honor the dead." Her voice rose to near hysteria as she described her son's death in graphic detail. The industrial accident, the cover-up, her failure to protect him. "Michael died because his mother was weak. But strength can be transferred. absorbed, taken from those who possess it naturally. The philosophical divide between Victoria's magical thinking and Ben's scientific worldview might have provided grounds for rational discussion under different circumstances, but grief had transformed her beliefs into dangerous obsession, and the presence of armed men eliminated any possibility of peaceful resolution. When Victoria nodded to her mercenary, he reached inside his jacket with deliberate slowness. Courage's reaction was instantaneous and unprecedented. The lion, who had been weakened by surgery and medication, somehow found the strength to break through the recovery pen's reinforced gate. The sound of splintering wood and twisted metal filled the air as 400 pounds of apex predator erupted into the confrontation with protective fury that transcended his physical limitations. The mercenary's gun cleared his jacket just as Courage's massive frame collided with him, sending both man and weapon tumbling across the dusty ground. Ben watched in amazement as the lion positioned himself between the armed intruders and the family, his single remaining eye blazing with intelligence and determination that spoke to something deeper than animal instinct. Emma's children had never witnessed real violence, and their terrified screams cut through the chaos like sharp reminders of what was at stake. David pulled them behind the sanctuary's main building, while Emma tried to maintain her 911 call despite the escalating confrontation. The nearest sheriff's station was 45 minutes away under normal circumstances, longer if deputies were handling other emergencies. Victoria's second legal representative fled immediately when confronted with an angry lion, but the mercenary recovered quickly and drew a backup weapon. His training was evident in how he moved, rolling away from Courage's initial charge and positioning himself for a clear shot that would eliminate the threat without endangering his employer. The calculation in his eyes suggested someone who had killed before and felt no moral conflict about adding a wounded animal to his record. Ben's intervention came from pure instinct rather than heroic planning. He threw himself between the gun and Courage, his 70-year-old frame absorbing the impact as he tackled the mercenary from an unexpected angle. The gun discharged into the air, its report echoing across the Montana plains like thunder, announcing an approaching storm. The physical struggle between an aging veterinarian and a professional killer should have been brief and decisive, but Ben's desperation gave him strength he hadn't possessed in years. His hands, weakened by arthritis but guided by a lifetime of animal handling, found the mercenary's throat and applied pressure with surgical precision. Meanwhile, Courage circled the combatants with predatory patience, waiting for an opportunity to intervene without endangering his protector. Victoria's complete psychological collapse occurred as she watched her carefully orchestrated plan disintegrate into chaos. The control she had maintained through wealth and planning evaporated when confronted with the raw reality of violence. She began screaming incoherently about Michael's death, her failure as a mother, and the cosmic injustice of losing the only connection to power that might redeem her perceived weaknesses. The turning point came when Sophie, despite her parents' attempts to keep her safe, broke free and ran toward her grandfather. Her 12-year-old voice cut through the adult madness with simple clarity. "Leave my grandpa alone." The sight of a child willingly entering danger to protect family triggered something profound in Courage's behavior. He moved to shield Sophie while simultaneously maintaining his defensive position around Ben. David's documentation of these events through his phone camera would later prove crucial for legal proceedings, but in the moment, he was simply a father watching his children witness trauma that would require years of therapy to process. His journalistic training told him to remain objective and record everything, but his parental instincts demanded action to protect his family from psychological damage. The mercenary's tactical error came when he underestimated both Ben's determination and Courage's intelligence. Focused on the immediate threat from the lion, he failed to account for the veterinarian's knowledge of pressure points and anatomical vulnerabilities. Ben's chokehold, applied with the same precision he used for surgical procedures, cut off blood flow to the brain with medical efficiency. Emma's arrival with a hunting rifle from Ben's gun cabinet shifted the confrontation's dynamic completely. Her childhood had included enough time at the sanctuary to learn basic firearm safety, and her protective instincts as a mother overrode any hesitation about pointing a weapon at another human being. "Step away from my father," she commanded, her voice carrying the same steel that had built her successful marketing career. Victoria's final desperate gambit involved pulling her own small pistol from her purse, but her hand shook too violently to maintain proper aim. Her threats became increasingly incoherent as she demanded that everyone surrender courage to her custody or face the consequences of interfering with her sacred mission. The breakdown was complete. A successful pharmaceutical executive reduced to a grief-maddened woman waving a gun at children while screaming about spiritual redemption through animal sacrifice. The standoff stretched across minutes that felt like hours, with each participant locked in positions that could only end in violence or surrender. Ben remained protective of Courage despite his own injuries. Emma held her rifle steady despite her inexperience with confrontation. David shielded his children while recording evidence, and Victoria wavered between coherent threats and complete psychological collapse. The resolution came when Courage made a decision that defied everything Ben thought he understood about animal behavior. Instead of maintaining his defensive position, the lion moved slowly toward Victoria with deliberate calmness, his single eye focused on her with what could only be described as compassion. The approach was clearly non-threatening, almost gentle, as if the animal recognized another wounded creature in need of healing rather than an enemy requiring destruction. Victoria's gun trembled as Courage approached, her finger hovering over the trigger while tears streamed down her perfectly made-up face. The lion's gentle approach seemed to confuse her more than aggressive behavior would have. She had prepared for a monster to fight, not a wounded creature offering what looked remarkably like understanding. "Stay back," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction, only the broken desperation of someone whose carefully constructed delusions were crumbling in real time. Ben watched in horror as Victoria's mental state deteriorated beyond reason. The pharmaceutical heiress who had arrived weeks ago with polished confidence now resembled a cornered animal herself. Her designer clothes disheveled, and her eyes holding the wild look of someone who had traveled too far down a dark path to find their way back. When she began talking to someone who wasn't there, addressing her dead son Michael as if he were standing beside her, Ben realized they were dealing with a complete psychological break. "Michael, Mommy's going to make it right," Victoria murmured, her gun now pointing erratically between Courage and the family. "I found the strength you needed, baby, the power to protect you like I should have before." Her voice took on the sing-song quality of someone retreating into fantasy as reality became too painful to bear. The grief that had driven her to seek supernatural solutions had finally consumed what remained of her rational mind. Emma's hands shook as she maintained her aim, her maternal instincts warring with a lifetime of avoiding violence. She had never imagined she would point a weapon at another human being, let alone in front of her children. But watching her father bleeding from his struggle with the mercenary had awakened protective instincts that overrode every other consideration. "Put the gun down, Victoria," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Nobody else has to get hurt here." The mercenary, still unconscious from Ben's chokehold, lay motionless near the broken recovery pen while Courage continued his impossibly gentle approach toward Victoria. The lion's behavior defied every principle of predator psychology that Ben had learned in 4 decades of veterinary practice. Animals, especially wounded ones, should have responded to obvious threats, with either fight or flight responses, not this careful, almost therapeutic movement towards someone clearly intent on causing harm. Sophie and Jake huddled behind David, their young minds struggling to process the adult madness unfolding around them. The violence they were witnessing bore no resemblance to the sanitized conflicts they had seen in movies or video games. This was raw, human desperation played out with real consequences, and their grandfather's blood on the ground served as stark reminder that people they loved could be genuinely hurt or killed. Victoria's breakdown accelerated when Courage stopped just outside her reach, his single remaining eye fixed on her face with an expression that seemed almost human in its compassion. "You don't understand," she sobbed, speaking now directly to the lion as if he could comprehend her words. "He was everything to me. My beautiful boy, my perfect son. The company killed him because I wasn't strong enough to fight the board, to demand better safety measures, to protect what mattered most." The truth of Michael's death spilled out in fragmented confessions that revealed the depths of Victoria's guilt and self-hatred. Her son had died in an industrial accident that could have been prevented if she had prioritized worker safety over quarterly profits. The weight of that knowledge had driven her to seek impossible solutions, magical thinking that promised redemption through absorbing the strength of apex predators. Ben recognized the symptoms of complicated grief that had transformed into something pathological. His own experience losing Sarah had brought him to the edge of similar despair. But his work with wounded animals had provided healthy outlets for his pain. Victoria had no such anchors. Only wealth that enabled her darkest impulses and isolation that allowed delusions to flourish unchecked. "Victoria, listen to me," Ben said softly, his veterinarian's instincts telling him to approach this breakdown like he would a panicked animal. "Losing someone you love doesn't make you weak. Grief doesn't require redemption. It requires acceptance." His words were punctuated by his own labored breathing from the physical struggle, but his voice carried the gentle authority that had calmed countless frightened creatures over the years. The sound of approaching sirens finally reached them across the Montana plains, but 45 minutes felt like an eternity when measured against the immediate crisis. Victoria's reaction to the distant law enforcement was to press the gun against her own temple, her finger tightening on the trigger as she spoke to her invisible son. "Mommy failed you once, Michael, but I won't fail you again. We'll be together soon." Emma's scream of "No!" echoed across the sanctuary as she realized Victoria intended suicide rather than capture. The complex emotions of the moment, pity for a grieving mother, terror for her own family's safety, and desperate hope that tragedy could still be averted, created a psychological whiplash that would haunt her for years afterward. Courage's final act in this confrontation transcended every boundary between human and animal understanding. The lion moved the last few feet to Victoria with deliberate slowness, his massive head coming to rest against her free hand with the gentleness of a house cat seeking comfort. The contact seemed to anchor Victoria to reality just long enough for her to lower the weapon, her sobs becoming quieter as she automatically stroked the lion's golden fur. "He's not afraid of me," Victoria whispered in wonder, her voice carrying the first note of genuine emotion rather than manufactured hysteria. "Even after everything I've done, everything I plan to do, he's not afraid." The revelation that courage could offer compassion to someone who had intended his death seemed to crack something fundamental in Victoria's manufactured worldview. Ben watched this impossible moment of connection between predator and would-be killer, understanding that he was witnessing something that veterinary school had never prepared him to interpret. Animals didn't typically show mercy to threats, didn't offer comfort to those who meant them harm. Yet Courage's behavior suggested an intelligence and emotional sophistication that challenged basic assumptions about animal cognition and empathy. The arrival of sheriff's deputies broke the spell, their presence transforming an intimate moment of healing into a crime scene requiring investigation and documentation. Victoria surrendered her weapon without resistance, her breakdown now complete as she allowed herself to be handcuffed while continuing to murmur apologies to her dead son. The mercenary regained consciousness just in time to face arrest, his professional composure returning despite the circumstances. Emma's relief at her father's safety warred with her realization of how close they had all come to witnessing multiple deaths. The sanctuary, that had seemed like Ben's harmless obsession, revealed itself as a place where life and death decisions were made daily, where her father's commitment to healing extended to risking his own life for a wounded animal's protection. As paramedics tended to Ben's injuries and police processed the crime scene, Courage returned to the ruins of his recovery pen with obvious exhaustion. The day's events had pushed his recovering body beyond safe limits, but his protective instincts had overridden every medical consideration. Doctor. Martinez, summoned by Emma's frantic phone calls, arrived to find her patient alert but clearly suffering from the physical stress of his heroic intervention. The children's trauma manifested in different ways, Sophie clinging to her grandfather while asking repeated questions about why the nice lady had become mean, Jake retreating into selective muteness that would require months of therapy to resolve. David continued documenting everything with his camera, his journalistic instincts providing emotional armor against the psychological impact of nearly witnessing multiple deaths. Victoria's final words before being loaded into the police car were directed at Ben. He showed me what strength really looks like. Not taking power from others, but protecting those who can't protect themselves. The insight came too late to undo the damage she had caused, but it suggested that somewhere beneath the grief-induced madness, the woman who had once been a successful executive and loving mother might still exist. As evening settled over the sanctuary, Ben sat beside Courage's damaged recovery pen, both man and lion bearing fresh wounds from their shared ordeal. The silence between them carried a weight of mutual understanding. They had faced something together that neither could have survived alone, and that shared survival had forged a bond that transcended the normal boundaries between species. The revelation that shattered Ben's understanding of his daughter came 3 hours after the police cars disappeared down the gravel drive. Emma sat beside him on the porch swing where he and Sarah had planned their retirement dreams, her hands trembling as she pulled out a manila folder thick with financial documents. The setting sun painted the Montana sky in shades of gold that reminded Ben painfully of Courage's magnificent coat, now marked by fresh bandages from the day's violence. "Dad, I need to show you something," Emma said, her voice carrying the weight of secrets kept too long. "Something I should have told you years ago." She spread the documents across the swing between them. Bank statements, donation receipts, and correspondence that revealed a truth Ben had never suspected. For the past 2 years since Sarah's death, Emma had been the anonymous donor keeping the sanctuary afloat. Ben's weathered hand shook as he examined the evidence of his daughter's hidden support, monthly transfers of $2,000, emergency payments when equipment failed, even the recent surge in funding that had allowed him to stock medical supplies. The amounts represented significant sacrifice for a family with 2 children and a Seattle mortgage, money that Emma had diverted from their vacation fund, their retirement savings, their children's college accounts. "You've been the mystery benefactor," Ben whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of misunderstanding 2 decades in the making. "All this time, I thought you didn't care about the work here. I thought you resented every animal I ever helped." The revelation rewrote every conversation they'd had since Sarah's death, every argument about his priorities, every cold phone call where Emma had seemed distant and disapproving. Emma's tears came freely now, washing away years of careful emotional control. "I was angry, Dad. So angry that you could pour love into every wounded creature that came through those gates, while I felt like I had to compete for scraps of your attention." Her voice carried the pain of a child who had learned to equate her father's compassion with rejection. "But after Mom died, when I saw how lost you were, I realized that this place wasn't taking you away from family. It was keeping you alive." The financial records told a story of sacrifice that Ben could barely comprehend. Emma had sold her grandmother's ring to fund Courage's initial medical evaluation. She had taken a second job doing freelance marketing work to maintain the monthly donations. Most devastating of all, she had convinced David to postpone his dream of starting his own business so they could continue supporting the sanctuary without Ben's knowledge. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ben asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah had always said that Emma inherited her mother's stubbornness, along with her protective instincts. Emma had been protecting Ben from the knowledge that his life's work depended on charity, even from his own daughter, because she understood that accepting help felt like failure to a man who had spent his life being strong for others. David joined them on the porch, carrying Sophie and Jake, who had finally fallen asleep after hours of processing the day's trauma. His expression held a mixture of exhaustion and something that looked like pride, as he watched his wife finally bridge the emotional distance that had separated her from her father. "She made me promise not to tell you," he said quietly. "She said you'd rather lose the sanctuary than accept family money." The truth of that observation cut Ben deeply because it was absolutely accurate. His pride had nearly cost him everything, not just the sanctuary, but his relationship with the daughter who had been silently ensuring his survival. Sarah had always teased him about his stubborn independence, calling it both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. Now he understood how right she had been. Sophie stirred in her father's arms, her sleepy voice carrying the innocent wisdom that sometimes emerges from children who have witnessed adult complexity. "Grandpa, why was the pretty lady so sad?" she asked, her question cutting through the evening's heavy emotions with the directness that only a 12-year-old could manage. Courage wasn't scared of her even though she wanted to hurt him. Ben struggled to explain concepts that challenged his own understanding of human nature and animal behavior. How could he tell his granddaughter that grief sometimes transforms people into monsters, that love can become so twisted by loss that it seeks impossible solutions? And how could he describe the inexplicable compassion that Courage had shown to someone who threatened his life? Sometimes when people lose someone they love very much, they get confused about what love means, Ben said carefully. That lady lost her son, and the sadness made her think she needed to hurt others to feel strong again. But Courage showed her that real strength comes from protecting people, not hurting them. The explanation felt inadequate, but Sophie nodded with the solemn acceptance of childhood. Emma's revelation about the anonymous donations was followed by an even more shocking discovery when David pulled up his phone recordings from the day's events. While documenting the confrontation for evidence, he had inadvertently captured audio of Victoria's phone conversation with someone identified only as the doctor. The conversation revealed that Victoria's beliefs about spiritual strength transfer weren't entirely her own invention. She had been influenced by someone with medical credentials who legitimized her delusions. "We need to turn this over to the police," David said, his journalistic instincts recognizing the implications of organized exploitation targeting grieving families. "If there's someone out there encouraging this kind of magical thinking among people who have lost children, Victoria might not be the only victim." The recording suggested a larger pattern of predation that turned parental grief into profitable delusion. Ben listened to the audio with growing horror as he recognized psychological manipulation techniques that preyed on the most vulnerable aspects of human nature. Someone with medical knowledge was deliberately fostering beliefs that led to animal cruelty and human tragedy, turning grief into a commodity that could be exploited for financial gain. The revelation added another layer of tragedy to Victoria's story. She wasn't just a grieving mother who had lost her way, but a victim of someone who had deliberately corrupted her healing process. The evening's final revelation came when Dr. Martinez arrived to check on Courage's condition after the day's physical stress. Her examination revealed something that challenged everything they thought they understood about the lion's recovery. Despite the obvious trauma of breaking through reinforced barriers and engaging in physical confrontation, Courage showed no signs of surgical site damage or internal injury. "This is medically impossible," Dr. Martinez murmured as she studied Courage's post-confrontation vitals. "The adrenaline surge alone should have caused significant complications, not to mention the physical exertion of breaking through that gate." She ran her hands along the lion's frame, checking for signs of internal bleeding or tissue damage that simply weren't present. "It's almost like his protective instincts overrode normal physiological limitations." Ben watched Courage's gentle interaction with Dr. Martinez, noting how the lion remained calm despite the day's violence and trauma. The behavior suggested not just physical resilience, but an emotional stability that seemed to transcend normal animal psychology. Animals that had experienced severe stress typically showed signs of ongoing agitation, yet Courage appeared to have processed the confrontation and moved beyond it with remarkable emotional maturity. The discovery that would reshape their understanding of animal intelligence came when Sophie approached Courage's damaged pen with a drawing she had made during the evening's quiet hours. The crayon artwork depicted the day's events with the emotional clarity that children bring to traumatic experiences. Ben and Courage standing together against dark figures, Emma protecting her family, and Victoria surrounded by gray clouds that represented her sadness. Courage's reaction to the drawing was unprecedented in Ben's veterinary experience. The lion studied the paper with obvious interest, his single remaining eye moving across the images as if he truly understood their representational meaning. When Sophie pointed to the drawing of herself and said, "That's me, and that's you protecting Grandpa," Courage responded with a soft rumble that sounded remarkably like acknowledgement. "Animals don't understand representational art, Doctor," Martinez said quietly, but her voice carried uncertainty as she watched Courage's continued interest in Sophie's drawing. "They can't make connections between images and real events. It's cognitively impossible." Yet the evidence before them suggested otherwise, challenging fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness and emotional intelligence. Emma's final confession came as they prepared to spend the night at the sanctuary, unwilling to leave Ben alone after the day's trauma. She revealed that her marketing work had brought her into contact with animal welfare organizations across the country, and she had been quietly building a network of support for the sanctuary that went far beyond her personal donations. Major foundations were interested in Ben's rehabilitation methods. Veterinary schools wanted to study his techniques, and wildlife preservation groups saw the sanctuary as a model for trauma recovery in rescued animals. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you about the opportunities," Emma said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone finally able to share long-held plans. "There's enough interest and funding to expand the sanctuary, hire additional staff, maybe even establish a research partnership with the veterinary college." The possibilities she described represented everything Ben had dreamed of, but never dared to hope for. Financial security, scientific validation, and a legacy that could outlast his own lifetime. The day that had begun with Victoria's desperate attempt to steal Courage had ended with revelations that transformed every relationship and assumption in Ben's life. His daughter's secret support, the lion's impossible compassion, and the promise of a future that honored both Sarah's memory and their shared commitment to healing wounded creatures. As Montana stars emerged in the darkening sky, Ben realized that sometimes the most profound truths emerge from the most devastating crises, and that love, whether between humans or across species boundaries, finds ways to survive and flourish even in the darkest circumstances. 3 months later, the Second Chance Wildlife Sanctuary bustled with activity that would have seemed impossible during those dark August days when Ben faced losing everything. The new educational center, funded by a coalition of wildlife organizations that Emma had assembled, stood where the old storage shed had been, its windows designed to provide safe viewing areas for visitors to observe the animals without causing stress. Sophie and Jake had spent their entire summer vacation helping design the children's education programs, their enthusiasm infectious among the volunteer staff who now assisted with daily operations. Ben stood beside Courage's new enclosure, watching his granddaughter read aloud to a group of visiting school children while the lion rested peacefully nearby. The specialized habitat had been designed with input from animal behaviorists who recognized Courage's unique psychological needs, space for solitude when desired, but visual connection to the family that had become his pride. The distinctive scar where his left eye had been removed had healed into a mark of character rather than disfigurement, and visitors often commented on the nobility it lent to his bearing. Emma had taken a leave of absence from her Seattle marketing firm to manage the sanctuary's expansion, her business skills proving invaluable in navigating the complex world of nonprofit funding and regulatory compliance. Her childhood resentment about competing with animals for her father's attention had transformed into appreciation for the healing work that gave both Ben and the rescued creatures purpose and dignity. The new living quarters she had designed allowed Ben to maintain his independence while ensuring he was never truly alone. David's journalistic documentation of Victoria's confrontation had attracted national attention, leading to a documentary film project that would fund sanctuary operations for years to come. More importantly, his investigation into the mysterious doctor who had encouraged Victoria's delusions had exposed a network of practitioners who exploited grieving families by promoting pseudo-scientific beliefs about animal spirituality. The resulting legal proceedings had shut down several fraudulent operations and protected other vulnerable people from similar manipulation. Dr. Martinez had published a paper about Courage's unusual recovery and behavior in the Journal of Veterinary Behavioral Medicine, establishing the sanctuary as a research site for studying trauma recovery in large predators. Her ongoing studies of the lion's interactions with humans had attracted graduate students from across the country, all eager to understand the neurological basis for the empathy and intelligence that Courage displayed daily. The research funding provided steady income while advancing scientific understanding of animal consciousness. Victoria Sterling's story had taken an unexpected turn toward genuine redemption. The psychiatric evaluation mandated by her plea agreement revealed that her grief-induced psychosis had been exacerbated by the manipulative treatments she had received from unlicensed practitioners. With proper therapy and medication, she had begun to process Michael's death in healthier ways, establishing a foundation that funded workplace safety improvements rather than pursuing impossible spiritual transfers of strength. Her first visit to the sanctuary since the confrontation had been carefully supervised and emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Victoria's interaction with Courage, the animal she had planned to kill for ritualistic purposes, demonstrated the profound change that proper mental health treatment could achieve. The lion's gentle acceptance of her presence, despite everything that had occurred, became a powerful symbol of forgiveness that aided her psychological recovery. "I understand now that Michael's death wasn't my failure," Victoria had told Ben during that visit, her voice carrying the hard-won wisdom of someone who had traveled to the edge of madness and returned. It was a tragedy that no amount of magical thinking could undo. The strength I was seeking already existed, in the love that makes us willing to protect others, even when we're afraid. Her foundation's first major grant had funded the sanctuary's new medical facility, ensuring that other animals would receive the surgical care that had saved Courage's life. The revelation that had surprised everyone, including Ben, was Courage's response to the arrival of Luna, a young lioness rescued from an illegal breeding operation. The introduction of a potential mate had been planned carefully, with months of preparation and expert consultation about the psychological complexities of pairing rescued big cats. Nobody had anticipated that Courage's protective instincts would extend seamlessly to Luna, or that his unusual intelligence would manifest in teaching her to trust humans despite her history of abuse. Luna's recovery under Courage's influence became a case study in animal psychology that challenged conventional wisdom about predator socialization. The lioness, who had been violently aggressive toward all humans when she arrived, gradually learned to tolerate and eventually accept human presence by observing Courage's calm interactions with the sanctuary staff. The bond between the two lions suggested that emotional healing in animals, like humans, often required community and connection rather than isolation. Sophie's development as a young naturalist had been one of the summer's most heartwarming transformations. Her natural empathy with animals, combined with her grandfather's patient teaching, had revealed an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that impressed the professional staff. At 12 years old, she could read subtle signs of stress or contentment in the sanctuary's residents with accuracy that rivaled trained veterinarians. Her dream of following in Ben's footsteps had evolved into concrete plans for veterinary school and specialized study in wildlife rehabilitation. Jake's contribution to the sanctuary had been quieter but equally meaningful. His talent for photography, encouraged by his father's documentary work, had produced images that captured the emotional depth of animal-human relationships in ways that technical medical documentation couldn't convey. His photographs of Courage and Luna had become central to the sanctuary's fundraising materials, their beauty helping donors understand that supporting animal welfare meant preserving relationships and dignity rather than simply maintaining biological functions. The expansion of the sanctuary had attracted Helen Morrison, a recently retired veterinary nurse whose expertise in large animal care filled a crucial gap in the facility's capabilities. Her growing friendship with Ben had surprised everyone, including Ben himself, who had assumed that his capacity for romantic connection had died with Sarah. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared professional values and mutual respect for the healing work that defined both their lives. "Sarah would have liked you," Ben told Helen one evening as they watched Courage and Luna settle into their evening routine. "She always said that the best partnerships were built on common purpose rather than common interests." Helen's response, that Sarah's influence was visible in everything Ben had built at the sanctuary, acknowledged the continuing presence of his first wife while making space for new affection to grow. The educational programs that Emma had developed attracted families from across the region, many of them dealing with their own losses and traumas. Children who had experienced divorce, death, or family upheaval found comfort in observing animals who had survived abuse and abandonment to find safety and purpose. The sanctuary's message that healing was possible, that broken things could become beautiful again, resonated with visitors who needed hope in their own lives. Ben's arthritis had worsened over the summer months, but the presence of family and staff meant that he no longer carried the physical and emotional burdens of sanctuary management alone. His role had evolved from desperate caretaker to respected mentor, his decades of experience valued by a new generation of wildlife rehabilitation professionals. The knowledge that his work would continue beyond his own lifetime provided peace that had eluded him since Sarah's death. The documentary filming had captured moments of profound beauty and meaning that transcended the original story of Victoria's confrontation. Footage of Courage's gentle interaction with traumatized children, Luna's gradual acceptance of human kindness, and the multi-generational healing that occurred when families worked together to care for wounded animals created a narrative about resilience and redemption that touched audiences far beyond the wildlife conservation community. As autumn approached and the children prepared to return to school, the sanctuary had achieved something remarkable: financial stability, scientific recognition, and most importantly, a sense of family purpose that honored both the animals' needs and the humans' calling to protect them. The morning routine that began each day with Ben checking on Courage had expanded to include Emma's administrative work, Sophie's animal observations, Jake's photography, and Helen's medical care for the growing population of rescued animals. Courage's final gift to the family came in the form of 3 cubs that Luna delivered in late September, their births symbolizing hope and continuity that extended far beyond individual survival. The lion whose tumor should have killed him had become the patriarch of a new generation, his genes carrying forward not just biological traits, but the behavioral lessons about trust, protection, and the possibility of healing that he had learned through his relationship with Ben's family. Standing in the evening light that painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and amber, Ben reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment of peace and purpose. Sarah's rose garden, which he had finally found the courage to tend again with Helen's help, bloomed beside Courage's enclosure, creating a living memorial that celebrated both human love and the bonds that transcend species boundaries. The sanctuary that had begun as one man's desperate attempt to save a dying lion had become a testament to the truth that healing, like love, multiplies when freely given and creates connections that strengthen everyone involved in the sacred work of mending what has been broken. Dear friends, Ben Hartwell's story reminds us that our greatest seasons of growth often begin in our deepest valleys of loss. At 68, after losing his beloved Sarah and facing financial ruin, Ben discovered that saving a wounded lion named Courage would ultimately save himself. Like many of us who've reached our 60s, Ben felt forgotten. His children lived far away, his life's work seemed meaningless, and tomorrow felt more like an ending than a beginning. But when we stop trying to be strong alone and allow ourselves to be part of something bigger, magic happens. Ben's willingness to love an impossible creature opened doors he never imagined. His daughter's secret devotion, his grandchildren's admiration, and a purpose that transformed his final chapters into his most meaningful. The truth Sarah knew still echoes today. Love multiplies when we give it away, especially to those society deems unworthy of saving. Your accumulated wisdom, your capacity for patience, your understanding of what truly matters, these aren't consolation prizes for aging. They're superpowers that the world desperately needs. What wounded creature in your life needs the healing that only your seasoned heart can provide? What legacy of love are you building in these precious years? Share with us. What impossible thing have you learned to love in your later years? How has caring for someone or something unexpected brought new meaning to your life?